The tank stopped moving, not because of a command, not because of a mechanical failure, because something hit it from a direction that shouldn't have been possible. The road had been cleared, the area had been swept, intelligence said the zone was secured, and yet there it was, a Merkava, one of the most survivable armored vehicles ever built, sitting motionless in a narrow Lebanese road, blocking every vehicle behind it. And in that single frozen moment, a trap that had been 20 years in the making had just closed. Stay with me, because what actually happened in southern Lebanon is one of the most strategically significant and least honestly discussed military stories of our time. And the further you go into it, the more unsettling it becomes. Most coverage of this conflict gives you a surface reading: casualty numbers, political statements, drone footage, press conferences. What it almost never gives you is the architecture underneath it all. The decades of engineering, planning, psychology, and patience that turned a stretch of rocky Lebanese hillside into one of the most sophisticated killing environments a modern army has ever walked into. That's what we're going to talk about. Because if you want to understand what actually happened, you have to start not with the day the tanks crossed the border, but with the day after the 2006 war ended. Because that is the day Hezbollah started building the trap. After 2006, Hezbollah's leadership made a decision that would define everything that followed. They looked at that war, which they publicly declared a victory and which Israeli military analysts privately admitted had exposed serious doctrinal gaps, and they asked a question that most organizations in their position would never have the discipline to ask. How do we make sure we never fight that way again? And then they spent 17 years answering it. What they built beneath southern Lebanon is not a tunnel network in the way most people picture it when they hear that phrase. It is not a few underground corridors connecting some weapons caches. What Israeli forces walked into was a subterranean country. A parallel military world of reinforced command posts, field hospitals, communications infrastructure, lateral movement corridors stretching across kilometers of terrain, all buried beneath villages and orchards and old stone roads that looked, from the surface, like they had looked for 100 years. Israeli intelligence knew tunnels existed. What they fundamentally did not grasp was the scale. And that gap between what they thought was down there and what was actually down there is the entire story. When IDF units began moving into certain zones in the early phase of the operation, something immediately felt wrong to the commanders on the ground. The resistance wasn't where it was supposed to be. The enemy wasn't fighting the way the intelligence files said it would fight, and the casualties, the ones that military censorship rules would delay in reaching the public, those were coming faster and from directions that made no tactical sense if you were only looking at the surface of the map. Fighters were appearing behind units that had already passed through and cleared an area. Explosives were detonating with no surface signature that surveillance had detected. Anti-tank missiles were launching from concealed positions that were essentially invisible until the precise moment of firing. And every time Israeli units tried to establish momentum and push forward, the environment seemed to absorb that momentum and return it as chaos. This is what 17 years of preparation looks like when it activates. The concept Hezbollah's commanders had applied is called shaping the battlefield. Every major military does it. You pre-position, you engineer, you identify approach routes, you build kill zones along them. The difference in southern Lebanon was the timescale and the precision. Every Israeli incursion into Lebanese territory since 2006 had been studied. Every IDF tactic had been analyzed. Iranian military advisors who had observed conflicts in Syria, Iraq, and Ukraine had brought additional layers of learning into the planning. And the result was a defensive architecture that, when Israeli forces entered it, performed almost exactly as its designers had intended. But here is the part that genuinely disturbed military analysts watching from the outside. There is significant evidence that certain Israeli advances were not just met with resistance. They were invited in. Hezbollah commanders appear to have deliberately allowed initial Israeli movement into certain areas, providing minimal resistance at the entry points, creating an impression of forward momentum and success. And then, once Israeli units had committed and moved beyond easy extraction, the prepared defenses deeper inside the zone revealed themselves. Military history has a name for this. The luring, the Teutoburg Forest, the Pacific Island campaigns, Vietnam, Afghanistan. The guerrilla force retreats before the advancing army, and the advancing army calls it progress, right up until the moment the retreat stops and the walls close in. The Merkava tank, which exists because Israeli engineers spent decades designing specifically for crew survivability, knowing that every soldier who doesn't come home is a political and social catastrophe in Israeli society, had been studied by Hezbollah with the same seriousness. The Kornet missile system, Russian-designed, Iranian-supplied, laser-guided, had already demonstrated in 2006 that it could defeat Merkava armor. Since then, more variants had been acquired, more operators had been trained, and they had been positioned not randomly, but with a specific understanding of where Israeli armored columns would need to travel. A disabled tank in a narrow Lebanese mountain road does not just represent one casualty. It becomes an obstacle that stops every vehicle behind it, bunching forces together in terrain that was selected precisely for this purpose, turning an armored advance into a stationary target cluster. Ambush, and then ambush again, and then ambush again. The IDF is one of the finest militaries in the world at a specific type of warfare: high-speed combined arms operations, precision strike, intelligence-driven targeting, network-centric warfare where sensors and shooters are linked in near real time. These capabilities are genuinely world-class. But none of them function the same way when the enemy is underground, when the front line doesn't exist as a line, when every structure in the operating area is potentially a fighting position, and every basement potentially connects to a tunnel shaft 40 feet below street level, close range, subterranean, slow, brutal, attritional. This is the kind of war that neutralizes technological advantage and turns the conflict into something ancient and terrible. Two sides fighting for inches of tunnel and meters of rubble, and one of those sides has been practicing for exactly this for nearly 2 decades. Hezbollah's communications network added another dimension that shaped every Israeli command decision throughout the operation. The group had invested in a hardened underground communications architecture that was largely resistant to Israeli electronic warfare and signal interception. Hezbollah units could coordinate with a degree of operational security that observers found genuinely remarkable. Israeli forces, by contrast, were operating in terrain that actively degraded their conventional communication advantages. Tunnels create dead zones. The topographic complexity of southern Lebanon blocks line-of-sight radio transmission. The speed at which fighters could disappear underground and re-emerge somewhere completely unexpected created command pictures that were genuinely uncertain in ways that modern warfare, with all its sensors and satellites, is supposed to have eliminated. Commanders on the ground were navigating a fog of war denser than the technology surrounding them suggested should have been possible. The drones added another layer. Hezbollah had developed and been supplied with unmanned systems ranging from reconnaissance platforms to attack-capable variants, and they were being used in the way that anyone watching the conflict in Ukraine would have immediately recognized: as targeting systems, as persistent surveillance over ground forces that previously had relative freedom of movement in the operational area. Every Israeli unit moving in open terrain now had to consider the possibility of being watched from above, with that observation being relayed in real time to fighters positioned in concealed or underground positions below. It added a psychological weight to every movement, every resupply run, every medical evacuation, that accumulated into something operationally significant. Hassan Nasrallah spoke for years about what he called the spiderweb theory. The idea, stated plainly, is that Israeli society, for all its genuine strength and cohesion, carries a specific vulnerability in its relationship with military casualties. That if the cost of an operation becomes high enough for long enough, the political pressure at home will force a strategic reassessment regardless of what the military situation on the ground actually calls for. This is not a hostile observation. It is a structurally accurate description of how democracies fight wars, and Hezbollah built it into the foundation of everything it did in southern Lebanon. Make it costly enough. Make the images of disabled tanks and returned body bags painful enough. Make the northern communities sit empty long enough. And eventually the political equation shifts. Tens of thousands of Israeli civilians had been evacuated from communities along the northern border. Kibbutzim and towns that had existed for generations sat empty, waiting. Every day those communities remained evacuated was a political cost with a political constituency attached to it. Every week without a resolution was another argument inside Israeli domestic politics about whether the stated objectives of the operation were being achieved. The government had made promises about restoring security to the north, and those promises were being measured daily against a reality that the military was struggling to deliver. The tunnel system itself, this extraordinary piece of underground engineering built in secret over years beneath the surveillance of one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence services, is simultaneously Hezbollah's greatest strategic asset and its most significant logistical constraint. And this is something that almost no public analysis addresses honestly. Fighters who go underground are fighting in a closed system. Supply becomes enormously complicated. Medical care for casualties below the surface is a serious operational problem. Morale in fighters living and fighting for extended periods in confined, dark, dangerous underground spaces is a genuine command challenge. The IDF appeared to recognize this over the course of the operation and began shifting approach in certain sectors, moving away from direct tunnel assault, which is extraordinarily costly for the attacking force, toward engineering solutions, specialized munitions, and controlled flooding designed to make the underground environment itself untenable rather than trying to pursue fighters directly into it. That shift was itself an adaptation, a recognition that the initial assumptions had underestimated the problem and that different methods were required. What makes this conflict genuinely difficult to analyze with simple frameworks is that both sides have real claims to having imposed costs on the other. Israel's air power and intelligence capabilities genuinely degraded Hezbollah's surface infrastructure, killed experienced commanders, and destroyed significant weapon stockpiles. These were real losses that the organization absorbed. At the same time, Hezbollah's tunnel-based ambush doctrine genuinely imposed costs on Israeli ground forces that were real, painful, and politically consequential in a democracy where every casualty is felt at the national level. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and they point directly toward why this kind of conflict almost never ends with a decisive military victory for either side. The hills of southern Lebanon have been fought over for generations. What changed after 2006 was not the geography or the fundamental strategic tension. What changed was that one side decided to use those 20 years to turn the ground itself into a weapon, not a weapon that fires, a weapon that waits, a weapon that absorbs. A weapon designed with one purpose: to make the cost of entering it high enough for long enough that the side doing the entering eventually has to reconsider. Somewhere beneath that ancient limestone and cedar country, in reinforced corridors where sunlight has never reached, that weapon is still there. Some of it was damaged, some of it was destroyed. But the engineers who built it are already assessing what remains. And the lesson that this conflict taught them, that the underground doctrine works, that a prepared subterranean defensive network can impose serious costs on a technologically superior conventional military force, is not a lesson that leads to abandonment. It is a lesson that leads to refinement. The next version is already being built, and the next army that enters those hills will face something that learned from this one. That is the conclusion that no press conference will give you. Not a winner, not a loser, not a resolution. A cycle, powered by the same underlying dynamics that have driven 3 major rounds of fighting since 1982, with both sides smarter than they were before, neither side anywhere near done. The question has never been whether it will happen again. History makes the answer to that achingly clear. The question is what happens the day after the next round ends, and whether anyone, anywhere, will finally find the answer that the bombs and the tunnels and the missiles and the drones never could.